Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. My name is Tony Mathias, and I am the Political Science Marketing Manager for the Higher Education Group at Oxford University Press. As the Department of Oxford University, and as a non-for-profit higher education publishing company, Oxford University Press is uniquely situated to offer the highest scholarship at the best possible prices in print and digital format. OUP has partnered with American University School of Public Affairs to bring you this event today, and I'd like to thank the school for its support and promotion of today's webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to welcome and thank Dr. Todd Eisenstadt and Dr. Stephen MacAvoy for taking time out of their schedules to lead our discussion on climate mitigation ambition in the wake of the 2021 United Nations report in COVID-19. Dr. Eisenstadt and Dr. MacAvoy are co-authors of the first edition of Climate Change, Science, and the Politics of Shared Sacrifice. It's published by Oxford University Press, and it's available in digital and other formats for your spring 2022 courses. Todd Eisenstadt is the professor and research director of the CEP Department of Politics at American University. He has quite an extensive bio, so please allow me to highlight some of his accomplishments. He's a prolific and an award-winning author and journal contributor. He has worked in 6 continents and studies development with research that focuses on democratization and environmental politics. He's presently leading a World Bank study on attitudes toward climate change among the most vulnerable in Bangladesh. In 2019, he published Who Speaks for Nature? Indigenous Environmental Movements, Public Opinion in Ecuador's Petrostate. His research has been funded by the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Bank, Fulbright Commission, and the National Security Education Program, the Ford and Mellon Foundations, and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Stephen MacAvoy is the Department Chair of Environmental Science at American University. Working in biogeochemistry and ecology, Professor MacAvoy has been particularly interested in how both nutrients and contaminants flow through and are incorporated by aquatic ecosystem components. Research and consulting activities have taken him to the Gulf of Mexico, hydrocarbon seeps, Barbados, 11 US states, and other locations. He obtained his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2000 and conducted postdoctoral work at the University of Georgia. He joined the faculty at American University in 2003 and became chair of the Department of the Environmental Science Department in 2016. Recent publications have appeared in applied geochemistry, environmental science and pollution research, ecological engineering, and marine mammal science. And he is currently conducting research on the inorganic and organic geochemistry of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. At this time, I want to ensure that everyone is muted except for Todd and Stephen, so we don't have any issues with any background noise. Feel free to submit your questions with the chat option during the presentation, and we will attempt to do what we can to answer as many of the questions as we can. And so without further ado, let's kick things off and welcome Todd and Stephen. Gentlemen.
Hello, thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Steve MacAvoy, and I will be starting things off here, and we'll present some information to you about some science issues, and then we'll pass the baton over to Todd Eisenstadt, who will then talk about the kind of policy implications of our topic. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. First things first. Can someone tell me if you see my slide?
We can see it.
Ah, Great. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming. This is, it's a big topic and it's important, and I'm glad you're interested in it. Todd and I have spent, we taught together for a number of years, and we really felt that we could combine our expertise and do something interesting with it. And so we tried to do that. And what we'll like to do today is talk about some recent developments in climate mitigation and a few of the policy implications of that. And I'm the scientist of the group, so I'll talk about changes in emissions and energy patterns because of COVID, and then how we're responding as we bounce out of COVID, which you can argue whether we are or not, but there have been some important changes. And then I'm also going to talk about changes in the biosphere and hydrosphere that we're seeing right now. There'll be one or two projections in the future, but most of what I want to talk about is what's happening right now, because that's important. And then Professor Eisenstadt will address the implications of the COVID emissions reduction and the greenness of the recovery packages being contemplated in the United States and Europe, and kind of what that will mean, given that we're about to start a big important meeting in Scotland in next month, I believe. And so we want to kind of explore all that. So to begin with, what we're looking at here is trends in energy demand going back the last 100 years. Now, this looks at percent change in energy demand over time. It's not a measure of absolute energy used or anything like that. And you see that there's some various shocks here and there. But if you look all the way to the right, you see, of course, that there's this massive decline in energy use immediately in March, starting in March last year. And the way the utility companies describe it is it's as if suddenly every day was Sunday. And so demand tailed off rather dramatically. And emissions did as well. This is a figure showing the emissions in the spring of 2020. And on the far left is worldwide overall emissions drop, and then different countries. And the degree of drop in emissions is related to mostly how stringent the lockdowns were. Now, note that this is change relative to 2019. Okay, yeah, and also it's projections. Okay, so there's a little bit of, we see a decline in the spring, but then you'll see later on that things did pick up a little bit, and their emissions actually did not decline quite as much as this model suggested they would. Emissions picked up a little bit, and we'll see that in a minute. Of course, this is what happened with the roads, use of roads and use of air for flying around, right? So we saw the dramatic drops in the use of cars, of course, and flights. So no wonder the energy demand dropped. Overall, like the total year drop in CO2 was at almost 6%, which is amazing, an amazing drop, and but still not as high as what was projected in the previous slide. But you take the whole year, it was almost 6%, which is a lot. It has, this year, it's bumped up. So year over year, we've gained 4.8% in emissions. It's still, not as high, though, as it was in 2019. We're still lower than 2019. Here we have a look at the change in energy demand by type of energy. And so the first two over on the left are coal and natural gas. And obviously those dropped because of electricity changes in patterns of using electricity. You didn't need as many generators. And so the power stations cut back on their use of fossil fuel electricity generation. Oil speaks for itself, right? Transportation. Nuclear barely saw a little bit of a drop, not much. But then renewables went up by about 1.5%. Now that's interesting because overall demand was crushed, but renewable went up as a percent of the total electricity used. That's because renewables are patched right into the grid, and they're as the electricity is generated, it's being used, and they can't really shut that off. So they let the electrical power from the renewables continue, and then they just dialed back on the fossil fuels because you can control that. This is another figure. This shows gigatons carbon dioxide in over time from 1990 to 2020 into 2021. So I wanted to show the rebound. So you look on the far right, you see that you can see the rebound of the 4.8% increase from 2020. Incidentally, if you want to turn carbon dioxide gigatons into carbon gigatons, you just multiply the y-axis by about 0.26 and you'll get that number. Okay, this is a projection, and the data is a little bit old. We'll look at some more recent data later, but this is total world energy consumption by type of energy. And the couple takeaways are that natural gas was projected to become a major player in the energy consumption and energy use market, and then also renewables is projected to rise even faster than natural gas, with coal leveling off. Remember, this is worldwide, including, Asia. This is, excuse me, let's bring it back up here. Yeah, this is a look at, pay attention to the panel on the right. This is a 2020 EIA projection for what's going to happen with electricity generation by source. So the last figure we saw was total energy consumption, right? And this is just what's going to happen in generating electricity. And you see, look what's happening with solar and wind. Like right now, wind is bigger than solar, but everyone projects that to flip in the coming years, and solar would be a huge player going into the future. And another thing with these projections is it's hard to project policy. Like how will policy influence this? And Professor Eisenstadt will talk about possibilities for this. And so it's important to look at the projections, but then realize that these are heavily influenced by policy decisions. Another thing that's happening I wanted to draw your attention to is the price of natural gas. It's going up. Like right now, it's going up. And that was a bit of a surprise. It's a hangover from COVID. And so the supply is less than demand right now. And so the price has gone up. So what you're looking at in the three panels are the price of natural gas is blue and the price of coal is gray. And the far left panel is the United States, the middle panel is the EU, and the last panel is Asia. And a couple interesting things is the price of natural gas is rising, and in some cases is more expensive than coal. If you look at what's going on in Asia on the far right, coal's always been cheaper than natural gas there. However, as of about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and this data is through September 1, okay? As of a couple of weeks ago, the price of coal started shooting up too. So even the trend I'm showing you now, that's data that ended in September, is already really changed. So it's going to be interesting. I'm kind of hoping that we don't decide to burn more coal because it's a little bit cheaper than natural gas, but we might. Okay, and another, I guess I'm keep showing variations in the same thing, but this is 2020 versus 2021 total projected emissions. And so we've got world, we've got China, we've got India, United States, and Europe going from left to right. And if we just look at the world overall, maybe focus on that one, you see that was a big drop in CO2 emissions. Millions of tons is the axis on the y-axis there, and then the gain in emissions this year is actually it's there, but it's less than the drop from 2020. And so that's kind of what's going on in the energy world, and dramatically and heavily influenced by COVID, and possibly heralding an opportunity for renewables. Renewables are growing at almost 14% per year in the last decade, every year on average. But the rate is ever increasing. So that's the backdrop for that. The second thing I wanted to talk about was some of the hydrological and kind of biological changes that we're seeing. And we'll look at precipitation changes, and then we know that the land and ocean continue to absorb almost 60% of total emitted carbon, but that means the other 40% is going in the atmosphere and just accumulating there, right? So, there is definitely a biosphere response. We do know, of course, that each decade, the last 4 decades, each subsequent decade has been warmer than the previous one. And we know that. We also know that the jet stream, the extratropical jet, is becoming wavier. So it's not as stable as it used to be. And that's why we're getting the jets are moving air masses around, and so we're getting a surprise Texas freeze last winter. In the summer, we had ridiculously hot temperatures, basically tropical in British Columbia. And so those kinds of things are all happening now, and they're all related, of course, to increasing the amount of energy in the atmosphere, basically. This is a view showing precipitation changes, and this is United States centric, obviously. And what we're looking at here is the precipitation change percent. So if you look at total amount of precipitation, what's happening? Is it going up? It's going down. The darker the green, the larger it's going up. The darker the brown, the more it's going down. And the map is divided. We've got regions around the edges. So you can find a region if you're in the United States and look at the trend like where you happen to be. Most places are seeing an increase in the amount of rain, total amount over the year. Exceptions are Hawaii, and then also parts of the Southwest. And you can just see from the map in the middle that shows the country, if you look at the different colors, you see that it is kind of a mix of precipitation increase and decrease, even within a region. But on the whole, we're seeing this isn't a projection. This is what's happening. This is another figure that shows precipitation data as well, but at this time it's different. What we're looking at here is the percent change in very, very heavy storms, very, very heavy precipitation events. So if you take all of the storms from 1900 to 2012, and then you look at the greatest 1% of precipitation delivery per unit time in those storms. So which ones delivered the most rain in the least amount of time? Those are considered very, very heavy storms. And then they looked at the percentage change, the percent change relative to the 1901 to 1960 average. And so you're looking at the increase or decrease in the percentage of heavy events, the top 1%ers in these different regions. And what you see is, again, Hawaii is dropping. Almost everywhere else is experiencing a greater number of very, very heavy events. So the rain, not only is there more rain, it's being delivered more quickly. That's the message there. And we're having trouble with our infrastructure because we're not good at handling it, right? We built our infrastructure for what it was like in 1950 or 1930. We're less ready for what's happening. This is a figure that this is actually a projection. So we're looking at fires in California, which I thought I really wanted to include because we've been hearing about them for months, and we're concerned about like what is going on here. Well, what's going on, of course, is that we have drier vegetation, right, and then and very low humidity. So because of the extra heat. And so what we're looking at here are the three panels that show number of fires and the fire size and the burnt area per year. And we're looking at the black bar is today, and the lighter green bar is the projection to 2060, what we can expect based on the modeling. So dramatic increases in fire, no doubt about it. And that we're not really even surprised at this, right? And then on the far right, these are Santa Ana fires. So the ones in the winter that are driven by the Santa Ana winds, and those are also projected to increase. Just a few more things. There's a lot of changes in the biosphere. So the spring is coming earlier in a lot of places. Some places it's coming a little bit later. And the cartoon I'm showing here is showing just two species of birds, one of whom is experiencing spring coming a little bit later, the other one experiencing spring coming a little bit earlier. And the reason that's important is a lot of birds and other organisms have timed their reproduction to food availability. So if you're a bird, birds love feeding their young offspring caterpillars. So many, many birds have timed the hatching of their eggs to when the caterpillars are out. Now, what's happening is if spring comes earlier in the environment where the caterpillars are, they hatch quicker, and they go into a chrysalis sooner. But the bird isn't experiencing the same kind of climate change because it's migrated from somewhere, right? So it's experiencing climate change there, and then it arrives at its spring feeding grounds or nesting grounds, and its food source has shifted. So it can't find the caterpillars, right? So those kinds of shifts are happening all over the place. And we're kind of monitoring them. And in some cases, the birds have kept pace with the change. And in some cases they haven't. But we know that not only there are changes in the phenological events, like the timing of things, but also we know that animals, all terrestrial species, 50% of terrestrial species are moving their home range towards the north as they stay within their temperature window, optimal temperature window. And then it's happening in the ocean too, but there's even more movement in the oceans. And then lastly, I want to kind of wrap things up with talking about not emissions reductions, but talk about ways to get the carbon from entering the atmosphere in the first place, or novel ways of getting it out of the air once it's there. And so there's just, the top figure is a facility in Iceland, and they are able to take CO2, mix it with water, and inject it into the basalt. And basalt's a very common volcanic rock, right? So it is very, very reactive. And so if you inject a carbon dioxide laden water into the formation, it spontaneously forms minerals. And over a 2-year period, the water that you've injected, 95% of the CO2 in the water you've injected will be gone over 2 years because it's been mineralized. That's nice because it's stable. In geologic time, it's stable. Unlike the injection into oil fields. So oil companies have been injecting CO2 into oil petroleum formations since the 70s. And now, of course, it's like, oh, we already had the technology to do the CO2 injection. Let's just do that. But then you have to monitor it, right? Make sure it doesn't leak, and you have to look for fractures and all that stuff. So it's maybe a little more risky. Also, you can have CO2 removal by just increasing weathering of rocks. This is kind of it sounds a little harebrained, but if you crush rocks, essentially you're mining basalts, and if you spread them over the earth, maybe you mix them with fertilizers on farmers' fields or something like that, they will weather, and as they do, they'll pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But we'd have to essentially almost double our mining operations as globally to get enough rock to make a difference. So there's that. Then, of course, there's direct air capture, which is just taking huge fans and sucking the CO2 into a potassium hydroxide solution. Then you mix that with lime, and it makes carbonate minerals again. And this is doable. It's actually, I've done it in my lab by accident, actually, but this is doable. But the last thing I want to make a point about is, this is really important. Until there's a price on carbon, all of this stuff is extremely difficult to do because it increases the cost of your operation. If you're an oil company and you're doing this, it's going to increase your costs, right? If you're sequestering CO2. If you're an operation that wants to build a whole bunch of ambient direct air capture CO2 sequestration facilities, someone's got to pay you to do that. So until carbon is a price, we're really not going to make a lot of progress. The Europeans are working on that. Hopefully the United States will jump on board soon. And so with that, I would like to pass the baton to Professor Eisenstadt.
Thanks, Steve. That really laid the groundwork, unfortunately, about the acceleration of climate change, despite some of the good news that we've heard immediately about this year. I'm going to try now to also share my screen and talk with you about a few more issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about how indeed, COVID reduced emissions last year, but overall, as Steve conveyed, the problem continues to get worse. And in fact, a lot of the recovery plans that we're seeing, including the kind of Green New Deal in Europe and the recovery package, the $3.5 trillion package of reforms in the United States, which has some climate change policies in it, those may be facing, to put it generously, political headwinds. And it seems that, some recovery plans around the world are not as green as was previously thought. And we can talk a little bit about that as we go. I want to talk also about how, public awareness of the climate problem is increasing and policies are coming out to address the scale of the climate problem. But as we see, firsthand, the United States and other parts of the world as well, notably places like Brazil and Australia, that, denialism continues, and denialism is taking new forms that we'll talk about briefly, and that the ambition gap between the emissions released and the policies to mitigate those emissions worldwide is not narrowing. I mean, as most of us know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018 released a report where essentially it said that we would need a 45% reduction in emissions. I believe that was before 2050 in order to really make a dent in needed, in emissions reductions to the point that we need to do that. Now, as you may know, and this is a great graphic from the Climate Action Tracker, the UN, since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015, has collected pledges, the United Nations has collected pledges from each country, which is a member of the agreement, over 190 countries. But the modeling done by many scientists, including the IPCC, which I mentioned earlier, and by Climate Action Tracker, conveys that, that we need to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of climate change by the end of the 21st century, whereas without the target pledges by the Paris Agreement countries in their nationally determined contributions to date, we would be headed for something in the area of more than double that, over 3 degrees Celsius. And according to the Climate Action Tracker and to some of the other sources, Climate Interactive, another great source for you to look at, we're headed well above 2.6 degrees presently, even with the pledges by countries to reduce their emissions. So we're in a bit of a bind. And indeed, I mean, just to show a longer extension of essentially the table that Steve showed, if you extend it over a longer time horizon, you see that while emissions stop going up as abruptly as they did before, that emissions have still been rather flat, and the COVID reduction seemingly will be temporary. So we've got our work cut out for us. And along those lines, I would just say that the European Green New Deal, which has been around and in discussion, would devote about 1/3 of their recovery from COVID over the next 7-year budget, which is about over $2 trillion US, would be devoted to environmental issues, and that Europe seemingly will, at least according to the pledge, seek no new net emissions by about 2050. They'll decarbonize the energy sector, they'll renovate buildings, they'll improve industrial emissions. This hasn't been finalized, but these are plans that are on the table and under great consideration by the European Commission. In the US, I think that the idea of a Green New Deal has been kind of elusive. I mean, this was a concept introduced in a short paper from a small think tank in 2019, a very short document that was very general. It hasn't been really detailed and itemized. And so what has emerged is the recovery plan in the US, the $3.5 trillion plan, which makes this bigger than most public policies and policy changes, at least in the social welfare area, the non-defense area, over the last 30 years or so, at least. The program, even at its 3.5 trillion level, is a bit smaller than programs like the Great Society and the New Deal spending in the 1930s. So if you compare real dollar terms to the real dollar value held constant from the 1930s to the present, this is less spending power than was present at that time in those programs. But I should also say that the actual climate programs in this spending plan are not huge. I mean, they are huge, and climate advocates say they're a great start, but they're not the 3.5 trillion. What they are, to just highlight a couple, is the 150 billion over the next 10 years in the form of a clean electricity performance program, which would pay utilities to switch from fossil fuel sources to renewables, and that this would increase electricity supplied by renewable sources by about 4% each year. And this will, over time, get us much of the way towards what President Biden has pledged as a 52% emissions reduction by the US, in fact, over the next decade, which is very ambitious. If this doesn't pass through Congress, and it's not certain that it will, at least not in its full state. I mean, a version of this may pass, a cheaper version, and that may get us part of the way towards the goal anyway. The other, I think, project worth mentioning here is also a large one, but it is to have electric vehicle charging stations located in a grid around the U.S. And a study done by the Rhodium Group shows that that this, with a tax credit for electric vehicles also under consideration, might boost electric vehicles to be something on the order of over 60% of sales per year by 2030. So these might bring some dramatic changes. Now, if you get electric cars, but the electric grid is still powered by fossil fuels, it's not nearly as good as if the electricity was generated from renewables. So hopefully these two pieces of the two prongs of this policy will be addressed together. But again, it's far from clear. There's a couple of very obstinate senators on the Democratic side. Their votes will be needed if this is to pass. We all have to stay tuned and see what's going to happen. And I think that these recovery plans, if you go to Vivid Economics, which was a study funded also in part by the United Nations, you can see that of the stimulus policies in about 30 of the most developed countries which were assessed, it seems that the environmentally relevant part of these packages, was really about a quarter of the packages, a little over a quarter. Here's a breakout of sort of the positives and negatives, sort of if you will, the green versus the brown in a range of packages. Okay, and you can look at the Vivid Economics to get more details. I hadn't seen other studies that break this out, but I guess the point is that we were all hoping that COVID would at least carry a benefit for climate, in that it was a time to stop and take note of emissions reductions and see how to reorient the economy. And it seems that we may be doing that to some extent, but clearly not enough. Indeed, I mean, as we've seen, and as Steve documented well, there's changing weather trends. There's new announcements about the relationship between climate and security, which I would be glad to discuss during the questions and answers. But there are causes for some optimism towards action, okay? Because the changing weather trends are provoking people to take note, and it's provoking new groups of people to stand up and identify climate as a real emerging problem that they need to address immediately. the price of renewables is going down. There's new research such as the IPCC 2018 report, which does really present dire news, as does the 2021 report that came out recently. And indeed, even on the corporate side, stakeholders in private companies are starting to demand understanding of green policies in the private sector. There was a survey done in part of this with regard to some of the UN related work, and in that survey that was conducted in 2018, it was found that most people thought there would be a disorderly policy response to the climate crisis. Only a few thought that there would be a breakdown and a fail to transition. About 18% of the survey. Some people thought that technology would save us, and a reference to Elon Musk and his efforts. And very few people thought that there would be an orderly transition starting now, which I think is what we hope to achieve, and what we really have to put our bets on, because we will continue to, of course, explore technological fixes like some of the ones that Steve mentioned at the end of his presentation, but there's really no way to guarantee that's going to come about. Anyway, I think I'm going to skip over some of the sort of possible transitions. I guess I should just mention that mentioning some of these possible solutions include carbon pricing, which I think Steve mentioned as being entirely critical. There's been efforts to try to create markets for trading emissions, that is, for setting limits on the amount of emissions that a company is allocated, and that if they want to emit more than their allocation, they have to purchase the additional emissions, the additional pollution, if you will, from maybe some other entity or company that is emitting lower than its limit, so that giving it an extra surplus of possible emissions that it can move to the open market. We've seen economists talk about carbon pricing for a long time, decades now. There are emissions trading systems which started first in Europe in the 1990s and are spreading to other parts of the world. The problem with them is that the price that is set for carbon in some countries that have these prices is mostly way too low. That is, if economists say that a ton of carbon dioxide emissions needs to be worth $60 or $70, and it's worth $3 or $4, then we're not making inroads towards solving the problem. But if companies are not willing to pay more than $3 or $4, what that means in part perhaps is that the amount of emissions allowable may still be way too high, among other things. I mean, there's a range of problems with pricing carbon and carbon systems that we could talk about, and these are issues which emerge in the emissions trading programs around the world, and also with regard to the carbon taxes, which are emerging as a form of, in some regard, putting a price on carbon that accrues directly to governments, whereas the other emissions trading system, as I very briefly described, it reduces the amount of pollution possible more than generating funds for governments to reduce carbon dioxide through other means. All right, I'm going to just skip along and just say that denialism continues, and this is a great graphic from an article in Sustainability, which is cited below. The problem with denialism is that now even most fossil fuel companies don't deny climate change, although Exxon did until somewhat recently, and that's famously become a lawsuit. But there's other ways of denialism, which include just obstructionism, or saying that climate change is a problem, but we need to keep studying it, sort of kicking the can of climate change down the road and, arguing that we need to continue thinking about it, or sometimes putting stock in in ways and technologies of addressing emissions, but not reducing them. In other words, treating the symptoms rather than the cause. And I would have to argue that carbon capture and storage, while a fantastic technology which we're going to need to rely on, it is a second order kind of technology. That is, it's not as good to capture the emissions you're allowing to continue to go into the atmosphere. It would be better to reduce those emissions. And I think oil companies and others are starting to advocate for carbon capture and storage by saying, well, emissions are bad, but we're going to do this other thing to offset the problem. I don't know, if the logic of offsets, which applies to some of these technologies, is as good as reducing emissions at the source, putting the filter on the smokestack, but or shutting down coal plants all over the world immediately. I think denialism is acquiring a sophistication that requires us to analyze messages and figure out how to, carry direct, strong messages forward. And I'm hoping we can do that. And I think the last thing I really want to say is, this is a little, I think my slides are a little too elaborate here, perhaps, but I think I just want to mention the COP26, which is the meeting to be held in Glasgow very soon at the beginning of next month, where the United Nations countries are coming together to reassess, take stock of the Paris Agreement. The formal stock take will be a little bit into the future, but what they're doing now is looking at a second round of nationally determined contributions. That is, each of the nations of the world that are part of this agreement are deciding what else they can do and what else they can pledge in order to reduce emissions. A few of the nations of the world have not yet submitted their nationally determined contributions, including the largest emitter in the world, China, and the third largest emitter, India. Of course, the US is the second largest emitter. And a few countries like Australia are not creating more ambitious targets. They're not ratcheting up their ambition, and Brazil actually weakened their ambition. So there's a bit of work to do. We need still at this meeting to work on Article 6, which lays out mechanisms for voluntary cooperation towards climate goals, such as market and non-market approaches. And market approaches precisely refers to pricing carbon. So at the international level, we don't really have a system of assessing the, implementing assessments of these emissions trading systems that have started to occur around the world over the last few decades. If we're going to have United Nations approval of these, or sort of endorsement, or even a United Nations constructed emissions trading system or price on carbon that is international eventually, which I think is the ambition of many people. And a way to address this problem is to have a good international one-size-fits-all tax on carbon around the world. Whether that's going to happen or not remains to be seen. But I guess what I'm saying is that we're not getting closer to that by failing to finish the implementing rules on how the Paris Agreement Article 6 is precisely operationalized and put into practice. Okay, so I think that's the main point that I'm going to make. Boris Johnson, who of course is sponsoring the conference, called it about coal, cash, cars, and trees. So he boiled down this meeting to a discussion of trying to reduce coal power and try to have, as the G7 has said, there would be no more direct government support for unabated coal power. China just agreed to not stop supporting coal power plants outside of China. It didn't say specifically what was going to happen inside China. Johnson said it was also about cash. And this is about the adaptation issue. We've mostly been talking about mitigation, about the area of trying to reduce emissions, which has sort of been the main discussion relating to climate change over the last several decades. But increasingly, adaptation is on the table too. Adaptation is, climate change is happening. How do we reckon with it? Many of the most vulnerable countries, I dare say almost all the vulnerable countries, are in the developing world. They're not the countries that created most of the emissions throughout the 20th century and even in the late 19th. And so they are frustrated. So there's a tension, and the developed countries pledged to offer assistance to the developing countries, and that assistance has not been coming at the promised rate. And so there's going to be some work on that. Cars refers to switching to electric vehicles, which perhaps the UN will offer some guidance on, and several member nations will offer examples. And with regard to trees, there's some efforts to have public funding and private funding to cut emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Also, another issue that we can talk about. I think my time is up. I just want to say in conclusion that part of the problem may be that we're hoping that of the futures presented in a very insightful article in Nature, we're hoping for the Green New Deal kind of resolution with government attention to these issues, the increase in renewables at the expense of fossil fuels going down. We may have a technological breakthrough which will help boost renewables, which will help boost renewables at the expense of fossil fuels. But more likely, we may continue also to have what's called in this scenario dirty nationalism, which is where fossil fuels continue to receive support, especially from fossil fuel producers and exporters. And we will probably continue to muddle on with fossil fuels being dominating, but sort of receding slowly, and renewables increasing as they become more cost effective, with some intervention and guidance from governments and the United Nations and all of us, but we need to do better than that scenario. We cannot continue muddling on. We need to succeed, and to do that, we need everyone's attention on this. And so it's been great to present to you, and I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Todd and Stephen, thank you so much for this informative and important webinar. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room. Jean asks, wouldn't a one-size carbon tax be unfair to low-income countries?
I think that a one-size-fits-all carbon tax, if it's the same amount, then yes. If it's the same proportion of income. In other words, I should clarify, I would definitely advocate for a one-size-fits-all in a relative sense, not in an absolute sense. Not the same monetary amount, but perhaps the same proportion of the cost of fossil fuels in a country's basic needs budget, right? In most countries, there's the basic needs budget, and sort of, take a similar amount, but mostly try and do a progressive tax that also addresses, more affluent consumers much more. And there's also a debate about whether, instead of worrying about taxes by countries, which is mostly how it's happening now, it is done by levels of income around the world. So a one-size-fits-all could also be based on someone's overall income, or in the near future, it could be based on one's carbon footprint, how much carbon you use. Amounts over a certain use of carbon would be taxed. And that might be a great solution as we figure out how to do carbon accounting.
Thank you for that. We also have a question from Daniela Stevens. She's in Mexico and she's a SPA alumni. Her question is for you, Todd. How do you think the new leadership in the United States will influence negotiations at the COP26, if at all? Could the US have some leverage on Brazil given the financial aid Brazil is expecting?
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. It's great to hear from you. And I hope all is well. I think that in a general sense, the new leadership of the US is having an important role at the COP and in the international community more broadly. I think, people in some of the other nations, I think Brazil has a climate denier president, and I'm not sure what we'll be able to do with Brazil or how relations with Brazil are going to improve that much. But I think that overall, our relations are improving dramatically. I think the rest of the world has questions about the US electoral system, that we could swing from a climate denier who removed us from the Paris Agreement during Trump's term in office. And I think we were formally out of the Paris Agreement for the last few months of Trump's term. And President Biden, during his first week in office, reinstated our membership in the Paris Agreement. So I think the countries are getting a little bit of whiplash about where we stand, right? Trying to watch us wiggle in the policy space. And so I think that has been a problem. But I think as domestically, President Biden is trying hard to get a domestic agenda that includes a lot more emphasis on climate issues through the 3.5 trillion bill that we talked about. I think other countries are going to be very sympathetic, mostly, European partners, Latin American partners, some of the Asian community and other countries in Africa as well. I mean, I think maybe not Australia. Australia has been on a policy flip-flops too, but most of the world, I think, is going to be very happy with the US rejoining the international community, although I'm not sure they're going to let us lead it again. I mean, as we tried with the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. We're going to have to earn our trust, and we're going to have to do that by being shrewd and advocating strong policies at this COP.
Thank you for that. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, both you and Stephen recently published a book with Oxford University Press. Can you take a moment to discuss that book and specifically, as you spoke about many of these issues in your presentation, how does your book address what you spoke about, with the exception that the fact that the UN report was already published by the time your book was published?
Okay, thanks. Steve, do you want to come in and?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So so a lot's changed since we finished writing it, and so it is updated for COVID, but it's updated for COVID as of June 2020, right? So a lot's changed, and that's why we wanted to talk about this with you guys today. We examine potential solutions to the problem, and we were trying to make an optimistic book. I mean, so we were focusing on what's happening right now, and less on at least from the science side, projections into the future. It's more like what's happening right now, and then what can we do? What's happening right now that might be useful for mitigation? And so there's a lot happening in the science world to try and get around this, like we're building better and better batteries. Electric cars are taking off, especially in China, and also the biosphere is responding in ways that are interesting. So it may be that the trees are growing more roots as they search for water. There's all these things that are happening that we're still learning about, and so we wanted to kind of emphasize what's happening right now, and then also there's other issues that are really important, like how are the soils going to respond? So soils contain 3 times as much carbon as all the vegetation and creatures on the planet. So how if the soils gain carbon, that would be important to know. If the soils lose carbon, that's important to know. So there's various exercises we put in the book that allow people to use their logic muscles and do some research if they want. And also I put in there on one of my chapters, I actually have a model. That's a dynamic vegetation model for the really ambitious who want to try that. So there's a lot of pieces. It's very comprehensive.
Just to throw in that I think I agree with Steve that we wanted to not have a hopeless conclusion, and we wanted to give students tools to make their voice known and to try and have some of the solutions. There's a lot of partial solutions, and we wanted to make those accessible. And I think those, if anything, those are starting to be more clear as we go forward. I think there's been details about some of the severity of the problem that has come out since the book was published. But I think the interdisciplinary approach using, some of these discussion of economic issues, of some of the political issues, the scientific and technological issues, and how these all interrelate, I think is essentially mostly the same. I mean, I guess, some of this needs to be updated, but I think that overall, I mean, we did try to capture a couple of decades of discussion of the problem. And so I think, yes, I mean, as time goes forward, we're going to be 6 months out of date or a year out of date. Hopefully maybe we'll get a chance to revise at some point. But I think the basic questions are the same. And I think, I don't think those have changed. I think what we're getting is more clarity on this exact scope of the problem and the potential of the solutions, which were present as ideas, but are becoming more concrete.
Thank you for that. I did have a question. My question was, will the cost of doing business the way that the world is doing business presently, which in many aspects is dire, will that cost ever be so prohibitive to the fact that it would make sense for companies and for countries to do the things to ensure that climate change is mitigated and hopefully, staved off, or as is, it doesn't get any worse?
You want to take that, or shall I? Sure,
I can try after you.
Okay, all right. I mean, just to say that, first of all, also to thank Tony, and also to thank Jen Carpenter at Oxford for putting this on and for helping us, in the publication and promotion of this book. We really want to thank you for that. And I think also at American University, Charles Leggett and the events team, we thank them. But all right, to answer your question, I think that, some economists estimate now that fixing the whole climate problem would cost, between 1% and 3% of the world's economic output over the next several decades. And so how are we going to get people to do that? The problem is that, this is a medium-term problem still for most people. Most people, although we're seeing more wildfires, we're seeing more hurricanes, we're seeing more flooding, I think parts of the world that are the big leading emitters are not seeing as much of that. And I don't think people are going to be convinced, and the companies are not going to be convinced without outside pressure. So I think what we need to do is push hard and get strong government action. We need regulatory action. We need more government intervention. We need governments to step up. Otherwise, we're not going to get what we need, because by themselves, the companies are not going to do this.
Can we depend upon activism, though, in countries like China and India, where it's harder to express yourself in that way to governments who have a very clear way in which they want to approach the way they do business and don't appreciate activism in many ways?
Yeah, you're right. And we're going to have to try and come up with some creative carrots and sticks to get the international community on board. I mean, we don't have a lot of sticks at the international law level. I mean, we have, economic sanctions, which have been used sometimes. There's talk in Europe of having a price on carbon and taxing imports that don't meet that price. So there is talk of some change afoot. but I'm not sure it's of the magnitude that we need. I mean, certainly we're also going to have to hope for technological changes, but I don't think we want to rely on those. I think things in China and India are not so good, and I think that there may be internal pressures brought to bear. But you're right; it's harder in other countries, and it's hard in this country too, because fossil fuels has such a powerful lobby and such a big effect on our political system, and money in politics is exorbitantly, has a disproportionate effect on our political system in the U.S. So these are big problems. They're gonna take unprecedented cooperation to solve.
Stephen, did you want to add to that?
I guess, yeah, I could add something. So I always think about, there's this Greek philosopher called Thucydides, and he had this idea that basically what motivates people is fear, self-interest, and honor. And of the three, honor is the least motivating. And so then it's okay. Well, now governments operate the same way as people in a way, and it's sometimes a little more, they're a little harsher than your average person. But what I keep thinking is two things. Governments, if they see it as a national security issue, they'll respond to that, and that, as China absolutely will. So if China sees changing precipitation patterns that are costing it a lot of money, that's a national security issue. So, and then they'll move. They also, I think companies, they're worried about, like, if they do something proactively that makes them less competitive, then they're just hurting themselves, right? So I think companies, they kind of welcome someone to come in and say, okay, this is what you're going to do. Like companies want to help government make the regulation because they know how to do it. Companies know how to do it. So I think they would welcome it if the government could agree that regulation was something that they had to do. Like I said in the presentation, unless there's a price on carbon, it's really hard to get motivation here. That would be the best motivator, is put a price on it.
Tony, to answer your excellent question and to follow Steve, I just want to throw in two more things. One is that, if solar energy continues to go down in price and it becomes a profitable industry, as is happening, and if green growth becomes more than just a slogan, as it is also happening, countries like China, with investment and strategic public promotion of industries, can continue to take the lead as they are in areas like photovoltaics. In other words, we can lead through carrots, which is profit. I mean, being green can be profitable and is becoming more so. So it doesn't need a technological breakthrough to just, to see the economic plan of profit through green growth. So that's one. And the second one, just to throw in, which in part makes, I think, the relevance of our book, is that young people are overwhelmingly aware of this problem much more than other generations. And, activists like Greta are really taking the world by storm, literally. And it seems that, there is going to be a reckoning, and governments are going to have to start reckoning with young people. I mean, they're uniting, and that social media is very strong, and that's a hope for the immediate future too.
Great. We had one last question in the chat box. This question is also from Jean. Don't electric cars on a mass scale require too much dirty mining? The Japanese seem to be going hydrogen for their cars.
I can take a swipe at that. Yeah, it's a lot of mining. And we might even have to do deep ocean mining of the manganese nodules, which took, millions of years to form, and they're not coming back, right? I think we have to pick which environmental problems we think are the most damaging, and try and solve the most damaging one. Mines are locally damaging, obviously, but nature heals itself. It might take 100 years. It depends on where you are, but it's it's more of a short-term problem than climate change, which could take 1,000 years to come out of if we were even aggressive about it now. So we're talking about long term. So I would say yes, there's going to be environmental drawbacks, and you have to weigh those. It's like with nuclear power, right? So there's environmentalists who've been anti-nuclear power, and they're still anti-nuclear power, but they're like, well, maybe we should reevaluate what we're really worried about. And I've seen that happening too. So.
And I'm just kind of curious, because my understanding is that with a lot of these mines are located in countries with the very poor populations to begin with. So it seems to me like it is sort of a environmental imperialism. Again, if we're going to these countries and mining these countries, when in fact it may be local, but it may be a global issue, but it's certainly going to be local to those countries that are affected with the mining and all of the issues that are surrounding that. And I just wonder that myself.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Tony. And but so if you look at China, like China has by far the largest proportion of rare earth metals that are used in batteries and renewables. And China wants to see economic growth, and they do their own mining. Like, we're not really going over there. So they would probably see it as, yes, we have a lot of people who need economic growth. Yes, we've got these minerals, let's mine them. The danger is, of course, that their environmental regulations might not be not up to what we would consider adequate quality, right? So then you run the risk of exposing the people who are doing the mining and working to conditions that are terrible. But it's China's responsibility to look out for its people, and they're getting much better at that. I mean, okay, I'm painting a very broad brush here, but and China will consume the products that it makes too. So it's not like they're making them for us. Like, they're making them for themselves, especially with electric cars. Holy cow! I mean, I don't know what 85%, maybe more, of electric cars are in China.
So is hydrogen then? Do you think hydrogen does have a chance, or do you think the world is moving toward electric cars?
I think it's moving toward electric cars because hydrogen cars are expensive, and the place where we get the hydrogen is usually methane. So you've got your hydrogen, but it comes from methane, and so what are you doing? You're just, now it doesn't have to, because there's a way to split water to get hydrogens from water, right? That would be really great, but it's very expensive, and it's explosive. So, Tony and Todd and the audience, I'm afraid I have to run. I have to get to another meeting that started 10 minutes ago.
Oh goodness! And we are at time. And there are no other questions. Let me just say thank you so much on behalf of all of us, Todd and Stephen, for this really engaging, informative conversation. Wanted to let people know in this presentation that it's being recorded, and we will make sure that everyone has access to the recording at some time early next week. And then finally, if you are interested in receiving a copy, an examination copy to consider for your classroom adoption, please feel free to connect with me. I'm at tony.mathias@oup.com. I put my information in the web box, but it will also be available once you receive a copy. So Stephen, Todd, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for your time. Everybody else, I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a great weekend. Take care, and thank you again.
Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.